The photograph was old, its edges worn, its colors faded by time. But there was no mistaking the woman in it. Her smile, radiant and alive, was unmistakably familiar. "You know," the man said quietly, his fingers tracing the image, "this is your mother. But she made sure I was dead years ago." For a moment, Tessa Morgan forgot how to breathe. Her heart thudded violently against her ribs. The man seated across from her had been a stranger moments ago, an elegant, enigmatic presence in an otherwise ordinary diner. But now his words cracked her world open in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. The soft hum of the diner's old fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, harsh against her ears. The warmth of the booth's vinyl seat beneath her felt cold, distant. She clenched her fists beneath the table, nails digging into her palms, forcing herself to swallow the lump in her throat. What are you talking about?" she managed, her voice wavering despite her effort to keep it steady. The man took a long, deliberate sip of his coffee. His sharp, steel-blue eyes had drifted somewhere far away, as if he was seeing something no one else in the world could. When he finally spoke, his words unraveled a secret that would change Tessa's life forever. Dee Dee's diner was nothing special. A greasy spoon tucked on the quieter end of Jackson Heights in Queens, New York, it was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The cracked vinyl booths, sticky laminated menus, and the permanent smell of burnt coffee and fried onions gave it a kind of worn charm. Tessa Morgan, 22, had been working there for nearly 2 years. Her hazel eyes, rimmed with exhaustion but still warm, darted around the room as she wiped her hands on her apron. She caught sight of old Tom, a regular who nursed his morning coffee like it was a prized possession, and offered him a tired but genuine smile. "Morning, Tom." "Usual." He gave a grunt that passed for yes, and Tessa scribbled the order on her notepad. Scrambled eggs and black coffee. Always the same. She didn't mind the routine. In fact, she clung to it. It was easier than thinking about everything else. She had dropped out of college 2 years ago when her mother, Claire Morgan, was diagnosed with an aggressive lung disease. The bills came fast and high, and there was no one else to help. Her father was a ghost from her past. She didn't even know his name. So she did what she had to, put away her dreams, and picked up a job waiting tables. Double shifts most days. Sometimes more. Claire used to be a vibrant woman, a seamstress who could make a gown look like it belonged on the runway. But those days were long gone. Now, Claire was mostly confined to a bed in their cramped apartment, tethered to an oxygen tank, her hands shaking as she stitched small things for a little extra money. Tessa never complained. Claire was her world, her only family. The bell above the diner door jingled, drawing Tessa from her thoughts. She turned, expecting a familiar face, maybe one of the neighborhood kids who always asked for extra fries. Instead, a man stepped through the door, and the air in the room seemed to change. He was tall, wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit that fit him like a second skin. Silver streaks cut through his dark hair in a way that looked intentional, as though time itself had conceded to his control. His presence was calm, but undeniable, like he owned the very ground he walked on. Tessa blinked. What was a man like him doing here? She grabbed a menu and crossed the floor. "Table for one?" she asked. He nodded, his gaze cutting through the room like he was taking inventory of every person, every shadow. Finally, his eyes settled on hers. Cold, sharp blue. Unreadable. "Yes," he said, his voice smooth but clipped. "Thank you." She led him to a booth near the window. The seat was cracked but wiped clean. "I'm Tessa. What can I get you started with?" "Coffee. Black. And a grilled chicken sandwich." "Coming right up," she replied. She scribbled the order and hurried toward the kitchen, feeling his eyes on her back the whole way. 20 minutes later, she returned with his food. The man was sitting exactly as she'd left him, though his focus had shifted. He was staring at something in his hand, a leather wallet flipped open to a photograph. She placed the plate and mug down in front of him with practiced ease, but curiosity gnawed at her. She stole a glance at the picture and froze. It was her mother. Not Claire as she was now, frail and pale, but Claire from decades earlier. Laughing, young, beautiful. her auburn hair tumbling over her shoulders, her green eyes sparkling. Tessa's breath caught. She blinked, convinced she was seeing things. But the image was burned into her mind. That was her mother. Without a doubt. She nearly dropped the plate. Instead, she forced herself to set it down a little harder than necessary. "Enjoy your meal," she mumbled before turning away. At the counter, her mind raced. Who was he? How did he have a picture of her mother? And why did he look at it like it was a dagger in his heart? Her mother had never mentioned anyone like him. Claire had raised Tessa alone. Her father had vanished before she could even walk. Could this man be? No. Impossible. Tessa forced herself to focus on refilling coffee for Tom, but her hands shook so badly she nearly spilled it. When it came time to bring the bill, she took a deep breath and walked to his table. He was still there, sipping his coffee like nothing was wrong. The wallet and the picture were now tucked away beside him. She slid the check across the table. "Here you go." And then, before she could lose her nerve, she blurted, "That picture in your wallet? It's my mom." "How do you have it?" The man froze. His coffee mug stopped midair. For a brief, raw second, something unguarded flashed across his face. Shock, guilt, maybe even fear. "What did you say?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper. Tessa's heart pounded. "That woman in the photo. She's my mother, Claire Morgan." "How do you know her?" The man set his mug down slowly, deliberately. His eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "You're sure Claire Morgan is your mother?" "Yes." Her voice shook but stayed firm. "I'd know her anywhere." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stood abruptly, pulled a crisp $100 bill from his wallet, and dropped it on the table. "Keep the change," he said, and moved toward the door. "Wait," Tessa called after him. But he was already gone. The bell over the door jingled softly in his wake. She stood there, her pulse roaring in her ears, the $100 bill crumpled in her fist. Across the street, the man, his name was Richard Dane, slid into the back of a black SUV. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and dialed. "Martin," he said to his assistant, "I need an address. Tessa Morgan. She's a waitress at Dee Dee's Diner in Queens. Find her. Now." "Yes, sir," Martin replied, efficient as ever. Within 10 minutes, Richard had an address, a rundown apartment building 5 blocks away. He stared at it for a long time. Claire Morgan, after all these years, and a daughter. His daughter. The thought hit him like a blow to the chest. Richard had spent the last 2 decades building an empire, Dane Technologies, one of the most powerful tech conglomerates in the world. But his past was a locked vault, one he rarely let himself open. He had walked away from Claire 23 years ago. She had been a dreamer, full of life and ideas that didn't fit into his carefully calculated plans. He had been young, ambitious, and afraid. Afraid of commitment. Afraid of anything that might tie him down. She had begged him to stay. He hadn't listened. He hadn't known she was pregnant. She never told him. And now, there was Tessa. Tessa's shift ended at 8. She walked home through the cold streets, the memory of the man haunting every step. She unlocked the door to their tiny apartment and was greeted by the hiss of her mother's oxygen tank. "Mom, I'm home," she called, kicking off her sneakers. "In here, sweetheart," Claire rasped from the bedroom. Tessa peeked inside, offering a weary smile. Claire lay propped up on pillows, her gray hair thin, her skin pale. "How was work?" Claire asked. "Weird," Tessa admitted. She almost mentioned the man, but stopped herself. Claire didn't need the stress. Just the usual chaos. A sharp knock interrupted them. Tessa frowned. No one ever visited this late. She crossed the apartment and looked through the peephole. Her stomach dropped. It was him. She opened the door a crack. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "I need to see your mother," he said. His voice was urgent but controlled. "Please." Everything in Tessa screamed to slam the door. But something in his eyes, desperation, maybe made her pause. "Why?" "I'll explain. Just let me in." Against her better judgment, she stepped aside. He entered, filling the small space with his presence. "Who is it, Tess?" Claire called from the bedroom. Tessa led him down the hall, her pulse pounding. When Claire saw him, her eyes widened. The oxygen mask slipped from her face. "Richard," she whispered. "Claire," he said, his voice cracking. "It's been too long." Tessa's world tilted. "Mom, you know him?" Claire's gaze darted between them, her frail hands trembling. "Tessa," she whispered. This is your father." Tessa couldn't feel her legs. She clutched the bed frame, her breath shallow. "What?" Richard turned to her, his face pale. "You're my daughter." Claire spoke quickly. "When you left, I found out I was pregnant. I tried to find you, but you were gone. I couldn't reach you." Richard sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't know. Claire, I swear I didn't know." Tessa collapsed onto the floor. She stared at the man who had walked into her life an hour ago and torn it apart. "You left us," she said, her voice raw. "For what?" "Money." "I was a fool," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I thought success was everything. I ran from love, for responsibility, but I never stopped regretting it." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Claire spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You found us now, Richard. That's what matters." He looked at both of them. Tears streaked his face. "Let me make it right." Tessa's anger battled with the ache in her chest. She wanted to hate him, but the sincerity in his eyes chipped away at her defenses. "Ow," she whispered. "Let me take care of you," he said. "Both of you. Claire will get the best doctors. Tessa, you won't have to work yourself to death anymore. I have a home in upstate New York. Plenty of room. Come with me." Claire reached for Tessa's hand. "What do you think, sweetie?" Tessa swallowed hard. She thought of the diner, the endless bills, the exhaustion. And then she thought of her mother's smile, the one she hadn't seen in years. "Okay," she said softly, "but this doesn't mean I forgive you." "Not yet." Richard nodded. "That's fair. I'll earn it." Days later, Tessa and Claire moved into Richard's sprawling estate. The air was clean. The rooms were warm. For the first time in years, Tessa saw hope in her mother's eyes. And slowly, so did she. Richard was true to his word. Top specialists arrived within the week, and Claire's condition began to improve. He didn't push Tessa. He gave her space. Time. One snowy evening, Tessa found herself in his library, flipping through an old photo album. Pictures of Richard and Claire, young and in love. She looked up as he entered. "You really loved her, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "More than anything," he said. "And now you." She closed the album, tears glistening. "I think I'm starting to believe that." He crossed the room and hugged her. Tentative at first, then tighter. "I'm not going anywhere this time," he promised. And for the first time in her life, Tessa believed him. For